Hello everybody, welcome to the week 2 video for the Kombucha lab. This week in lab, your lab group will choose the 2 things that you'll change in your kombucha jar this semester. So over the course of this semester, you guys are going to make 3 different types of kombucha jars. Type number 1 is your control jar. For your control jar, you're going to, let me scroll down a bit here. See where I am week 2 in lab, in the lab manual. See where it says design kombucha, and then it says following the ingredient list and making kombucha, page 72. Okay, so your control jar is the jar that is described on page 72 and following. So kombucha is fermented tea. Hopefully you will read that in your pre-lab. And so to make the kombucha, you make sweet tea, and then you add the starter, which is the microbes that will do the fermentation. So to make the control jar, you make a black tea with white sugar, like regular old sweet tea, except we're not going to drink it. We're going to feed it to the microbes instead. You're not going to make the kombucha this week. Making the kombucha happens next week in week 3. But this week, you're going to work with your group in lab to decide on the variables that you want to change in your jar. And so you're always going to make the control jar, 1 jar. Then at the beginning of the semester, you're going to make a 2nd jar, and it's going to be the experimental 1 jar. It is going to have 1 change in it. Like maybe instead of adding white sugar, you decide to add brown sugar. Or maybe instead of adding white sugar, you decide to add raspberries. Or maybe instead of adding white sugar, you decide to add honey or something. So you make 1 change to your first experimental jar, the experimental 1 jar. You'll be with that jar for a couple weeks, and then you're going to remake that jar. So the first time you make kombucha, you make 2 jars. Control jar, experimental jar number 1. You have those jars for 2 weeks. The fermentation takes 2 weeks. The second time you make kombucha, you make 3 jars. Control jar, experimental 1 jar again, and experimental 2 jar. So your experimental 2 jar is also going to have 1 change from the control. It's important that you only have 1 change, that you can keep track of what's happening in your jar and why the stuff is happening. Your experimental 2 jar can be also any kind of change. You can change the sugar, you can change the type of tea, you can change the amount of sugar, you can change if you add a spice, you can change the amount of starter you add. Any 1 component of the recipe you can change. So this week, in week 2, as a lab group, you guys are going to decide on what the changes are that you want to make in your 2 experimental jars for the course of the semester. Okay. So the first thing that you'll do for your pre-lab is do some reading, and you're going to watch a video with Sophie. You'll love her. She's a dog. She's fantastic. She helps to explain variables and hypotheses. In this lab this semester, instead of using the words independent and dependent for the variables, we are going to use explanatory and response. So the explanatory variable is going to be the thing that you change that explains the results. And then the response variable is the thing that responds that you're going to measure. The result is the response variable. So we'll use explanatory instead of independent, and we'll use response instead of dependent. So you guys are going to watch this video, read about variables and hypotheses. You'll read about kombucha, discover again that it's fermented tea, and then you're going to take this little quiz on Moodle. As a reminder, Moodle calls it a quiz, but it's not your in-lab quiz. It's just part of your pre-lab. Okay. After you take this quiz, then you're going to do the written pre-lab. In the written pre-lab, each of you will choose 1 change that you want to make. So your group as a whole is going to make 2 changes over the course of the semester. So you're all going to come to lab with 1 change, and then your group will figure out which 2 changes to keep. Okay. When you are 2 important things. The first thing is the explanatory variable is like a category. So let's say in my control jar, I'm going to put white sugar, and then I want to change the type of sugar. And in my experimental one jar, I'm going to put brown sugar. So my explanatory variable has to be able to apply to all of the jars that I'm making. And so I will say my explanatory variable is type of sugar, and then my control value is white sugar, and my experimental one value is brown sugar. So the explanatory variable is going to be a category, like type of sugar or type of tea or amount of spice if you decide to add spice, or amount of lemon juice if you add extra lemon juice, whatever. But it's a category, it's not a specific item or quantity. So your explanatory variable would not be brown sugar or cinnamon tea or 50 milliliters of lemon juice. It's going to be more like a category. So that's important thing number one for you to know. Important thing number two for you to know is in your pre-lab and in lab this week, you guys will choose an explanatory variable to change, and then you will write hypotheses for how it's going to change your jar, okay? So you'll look in the lab book here, variables and hypotheses, for like an example hypothesis that you can follow along. Part of the alternative hypothesis is writing what's called the rationale or the explanation for why the thing happens, all right? And so this is maybe the most important thing for you to take into consideration. Over the course of the semester, you will every single week need to be able to explain why the thing is happening in your experimental jar. Like, I fed my experimental jar brown sugar and it's growing better. Why is this happening? Or I fed my experimental jar gummy worms and it's growing worse. Why is this happening? And so in your pre-lab, it will ask you to read online, figure out the explanation and write it down, and then you're going to write it in your hypothesis. Your pre-lab will be graded for thoughtful completion. If it looks like you worked on it, you get all the points. If you leave part of it blank or you wrote nonsense, then you do not get the points, but just do a good job on it and you'll get the points. For the last page of the pre-lab, it asks you to fill in a recipe chart. For that, you'll go here to the Making Kombucha section of the lab manual. Okay, but back to the explanation / rationale. So when your group comes to lab, as a lab group, you're going to choose two things to change. You'll change one thing in your experimental 1 jar. You'll change one thing in your experimental 2 jar. It is super extra ultra important that your entire group understand the explanation and be able to write it in their own words. This is the defining thing that you should use to pick the explanatory variable that you will change, because you will have to every single week explain why the thing that you changed had this effect, and you'll need to be able to write on your end of semester poster why the thing that you changed had this effect. So if anybody in your group is not sure why it has the effect, then kick that variable to the curb and choose something different. It's really important that you be able to explain. Everyone will need to rotate through writing the conclusion, which is where you explain what's happening. And so it's super important. One of the main things this week is that you be sure that you pick variables that everybody feels confident in explaining.